The chandeliers of the Grand Metropolitan Hall sparkled above rows of polished marble floors, reflecting the glitter of diamonds, champagne glasses, and carefully tailored tuxedos. It was one of those nights when New York's cultural elite gathered, not just for music, but to be seen, to whisper about fortunes, and to flaunt their influence. At the center of the attention stood Alexander Graves, a world-famous pianist, often praised as one of the greatest interpreters of Chopin. With his Armani tuxedo perfectly fitted and a smug smile resting permanently on his face, Alexander was not only the star of the evening, but also the reason donors had poured millions into the foundation hosting the event. To them, he wasn't just a musician, he was an investment. So when Alexander's eyes caught sight of a young boy standing awkwardly near the Steinway grand piano, a white cane clutched tightly in his hands, he immediately sensed an opportunity to entertain his wealthy audience. The boy didn't belong there, that much was obvious. His suit was borrowed and slightly oversized, his shoes too worn for a place that polished. Nathaniel Carter, only 16, had come with his public school music teacher, who had miraculously secured 2 tickets for this otherwise unreachable evening. Alexander cleared his throat, his voice booming with theatrical charm. "Hey, kid!" he called, earning a ripple of laughter from the audience. "How about playing something for us? I bet you know a happy birthday, don't you?" A chuckle spread among the patrons, echoing off the gilded walls. Their eyes turned toward Nathaniel, expecting embarrassment, perhaps a clumsy attempt at notes, something amusing to break the monotony before the star performance resumed. Nathaniel froze. His fingers gripped his cane tighter as heat rushed to his face. The laughter wasn't loud, but it was sharp, cutting deeper than words. He could hear it in the tone, mockery disguised as encouragement. Beside him, his teacher, Ms. Harris, whispered nervously, "You don't have to, Nathan. Just stay quiet." But deep down, she knew he would not remain silent. Alexander stepped closer, flashing his perfect smile at the crowd, feeding on their amusement. "Come on, don't be shy. Our generous donors would love to see how inclusive we are tonight. Play us something. Show them how we invest in diversity." Those words stung more than the laughter. To Alexander, Nathaniel wasn't a musician, wasn't even a boy. He was a prop, a convenient symbol to parade in front of wealthy patrons, then discard. For a moment, silence filled the hall. Nathaniel's heart pounded. He could hear his own breathing, the shuffle of feet, the clinking of a wine glass. Everyone was waiting for him to shrink, to walk away, to confirm their expectations that he was out of place. But then, slowly, Nathaniel lifted his chin. His blind eyes didn't search for anyone, yet his voice carried across the hall with surprising calm. "Actually," he said softly, but firmly enough to hush the whispers, "I prefer Bach." The audience went silent. The mockery froze on Alexander's lips. Something in the boy's tone, steady, unshaken, made even the most cynical guest lean forward. They had expected a timid child, but what stood before them was someone entirely different, and in that instant, the evening's script began to change. Alexander's smirk faltered for the briefest second. "Bach?" The boy's calm answer echoed through the grand hall, bouncing against the marble and velvet like a challenge no one had expected. For a moment, the wealthy patrons exchanged puzzled glances. A blind boy, hardly dressed for the occasion, daring to utter such a name with confidence? It bordered on arrogance in their eyes. "Bach, really?" Alexander finally said, his tone dripping with mockery. He laughed, and soon the audience followed, their nervous chuckles covering the uneasy silence. "And which piece, young man? Something simple? A little prelude, perhaps?" Nathaniel didn't flinch. His voice was steady, almost unsettlingly so. "Partita No. 2, in C minor." The laughter died instantly. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. A few music critics raised their eyebrows, recognizing the weight of the boy's claim.
That composition wasn't a beginner's toy. It was one of Bach's most complex works, infamous for humbling even seasoned pianists. Alexander let out a genuine laugh this time, but there was a sharp edge to it. Well, isn't that ambitious? A blind schoolboy playing a piece that takes decades to master. He turned to the audience, gesturing grandly. Ladies and gentlemen, I suppose we're in for an educational moment. From the second row, Margaret Rothschild, heir to one of New York's banking dynasties and the evening's principal patron, leaned toward her companion and whispered loud enough to be heard. How rude! Someone needs to teach this generation their place. Nathaniel stood motionless, his hand still resting on his cane, but inside,
something shifted. His fingers, no longer trembling, relaxed against the wood. That single movement betrayed a quiet confidence his Aunt Deborah, watching from the back of the hall, knew all too well. It was the same calm Nathaniel carried before solving impossibly difficult problems, the kind of stillness that came not from arrogance, but from absolute certainty. Perhaps, interjected Dr. Henry Wallace, conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, seated in the front row. His voice cut through the tension like a cautious blade. Perhaps we should allow the evening to continue with the scheduled program. The boy has made his point. But Alexander wasn't ready to let go. The hint of irritation now colored his flawless smile. No, no, Dr. Wallace. The young man insists on showing us his sophistication, and I, for one, believe it would be terribly unfair to deny him such an opportunity. After all, his eyes locked on Nathaniel, he claims this audience might find Bach too advanced. A ripple of gasps crossed the room. The words hung heavy, dangerous, like a storm brewing in the distance. Nathaniel inhaled slowly, steadying himself. He hadn't intended to challenge the pianist's ego, not directly, but if Alexander wanted a confrontation, then so be it. Very well, Nathaniel said, his voice low but unwavering. But if I play, I won't just play notes. I'll show you what Bach truly meant. The statement lingered in the air, shocking some, irritating others. Many in the hall expected a humiliating spectacle, a blind boy fumbling over keys, a joke to be remembered at dinner parties. Yet a small, growing part of the audience sensed something else, something unexpected. And so the stage was set, not just for a performance, but for a reckoning. The crowd's anticipation thickened like smoke in the hall. Nathaniel stood still, his hand brushing lightly against the polished edge of the piano. To everyone else, he was just a poor blind boy standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. But what none of them knew was the storm of memories that fueled him, the years of silent preparation that had led to this very moment. 8 years earlier, Nathaniel's life shattered in a single night. A car accident had stolen not only his parents, but also his sight. He remembered the last image burned into his mind. His mother's face lit by the streetlights, whispering, "Hold on," just before everything went black. When he woke in the hospital, the world was gone. The faces he loved, the colors he once knew, erased. At first, grief consumed him. He was only 8 years old, forced into a darkness no child should endure. But then came the piano. Not a grand instrument like the Steinway before him now, but an old borrowed keyboard tucked in the basement of a small neighborhood church. His Aunt Deborah, who worked as a cleaning lady at the city's conservatory, had brought it home one day thinking it might help him heal. She had no idea it would awaken something far greater. Nathaniel's fingers learned to listen. He practiced until his hands ached, memorizing every key, mapping the invisible landscape of music in his mind. His gift was uncanny. After hearing a melody only once, he could reproduce it with near-perfect accuracy. By the age of 10, he was already playing entire symphonies, teaching himself through borrowed recordings, braille sheet music, and relentless hours that stretched late into the night. Music became his refuge, his weapon, his language of survival. Each note he played was a way to rebuild what life had taken away. He didn't just learn pieces, he dissected them. He studied the stories behind every composition, the grief, the joy, the rage that had shaped the masters. Bach wasn't just a name to him. It was a voice across centuries that spoke of pain transformed into beauty. But here, in the glittering hall filled with polished shoes and diamond necklaces, none of that mattered. To them, Nathaniel was an outsider, a charity case, a novelty. Alexander Graves' sneer made that brutally clear. And yet, as Nathaniel's mind drifted back to those long nights in the church basement, the worn carpet beneath his feet, the faint scent of candle wax lingering in the air, he felt a familiar strength return. He hadn't survived all those years of darkness to crumble now. Miss Harris's music teacher bit her lip nervously from her seat. She knew Nathaniel's past better than anyone in the room. She had seen him play until his hands bled, had seen him weep silently over keys that became his only way to speak to the world. If these people thought they were about to witness a pitiful attempt, they had no idea what was coming. Nathaniel straightened his shoulders, loosening his grip on the cane. His blind eyes didn't search for the audience, but his presence filled the room nonetheless. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was a survivor, a vessel of music shaped by loss, discipline, and fire. And soon, the world would hear it.
Adjusted his cufflinks and straightened his tuxedo jacket, his polished shoes clicking softly against the stage floor as he moved toward the Steinway. His smirk had returned, wider than before, though inside it was sharpened by irritation. This boy, this nobody, had dared to stand up to him in front of New York's elite, and Alexander was determined to put him back in his place. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with a theatrical bow, his voice carrying across the silent room, "before our young friend attempts the impossible, perhaps I should demonstrate how Bach is meant to be played." The crowd applauded politely, more out of habit than excitement. Alexander seated himself on the piano bench, his hands hovering above the keys with the practiced grace of someone who had spent decades in the spotlight. He let the silence linger a beat longer, milking the anticipation. Then, with exaggerated drama, he pressed the first notes. The hall filled with sound, precise, controlled, technically flawless. Each note fell exactly where it was supposed to, like polished stones arranged in a perfect line. His fingers moved quickly and confidently, the product of years of training at the world's most prestigious conservatories. To the untrained eye, it was dazzling, but to those who truly understood music, something was missing. The notes were there, the rhythm exact, but the soul was absent. The performance, though clean, felt sterile, like an expensive painting printed on canvas rather than painted by hand. In the front row, Dr. Henry Wallace listened carefully, his brow furrowing. He had heard Alexander play countless times before and knew exactly what to expect: perfection without passion. He leaned toward the critic seated beside him and murmured, "Technically impressive, but hollow." Margaret Rothschild, however, smiled smugly, convinced this display would silence the audacity of the blind boy. "Now this," she whispered to her companion, "is artistry." Alexander reached the end of the movement with a flourish, his wrists flicking upward, his expression triumphant. The applause came quickly but without fervor. It was polite, measured, the kind of response reserved for a performance that impressed but didn't move. He rose from the bench and turned to Nathaniel, gesturing grandly toward the piano. "There you have it," Alexander said, his voice slick with condescension. "That is how a piece like Bach's Partita is meant to be played, with maturity, discipline, and years of study. Are you sure you want to expose yourself, boy? The comparison may not be flattering." A ripple of laughter moved through the audience, but it lacked the confidence of before. Some guests shifted in their seats, stealing glances at Nathaniel, curious despite themselves. Nathaniel's hand tightened on his cane, but his face remained calm.
He had listened to every note, every pause, every over-practiced inflection Alexander had poured into the piece. And in his mind, he had already deconstructed it, memorizing not just the notes, but the emptiness between them. Slowly, he stepped forward. He set his cane gently against the bench and ran his fingers across the cool surface of the piano, his touch deliberate, reverent. The hall held its breath. For Alexander, this was the moment he expected humiliation, the moment the blind boy would falter, stumble, and confirm what everyone already assumed. But for Nathaniel, this was the moment his entire life had prepared him for. And when he finally spoke, his words cut deeper than any note Alexander had played. "You played it in D major," Nathaniel said softly, his head tilted slightly. "Partita number 2 is in C minor." The hall erupted in whispers. Gasps echoed like waves crashing against stone. Alexander's jaw tightened, though his smile remained plastered on, like a mask cracking under heat. "Ah," he said, waving a dismissive hand, "I was simply testing your ear." His voice wobbled slightly at the end, a tremor only those listening closely would notice. But Nathaniel heard it. More importantly, he felt it, the shift in the room. The same people who moments earlier looked at him with pity or disdain were now glancing at him with something new, curiosity. "Testing," Nathaniel repeated calmly, tilting his head slightly, his blind eyes fixed forward as if he could see through every facade in the hall. "Then you must know what Bach wrote that piece for." Alexander blinked, caught off guard. "For performance, obviously." Nathaniel shook his head.
Fingers brushed the polished wood of the Steinway, lingering there like a man touching the face of an old friend. "No, he wrote it after his wife, Maria Barbara, died. Every movement reflects a stage of mourning. Playing it requires more than technique. It requires having known loss." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the clinking of glasses at the back of the hall had stopped. The words hit like arrows, and everyone knew exactly whom they were aimed at. Alexander's lips pressed into a thin line. He had heard the critique before, whispered in corners by critics too cautious to publish it, that his music was perfect but cold, polished but lifeless. Hearing it voiced so directly, and by a boy, was unbearable. Margaret Rothschild crossed her arms, muttering, "How insolent!" But even she couldn't fully mask the unease in her eyes. Others shifted in their seats, their gazes now fixed not on Alexander, but on Nathaniel. "Enough philosophy," Alexander snapped, his mask slipping further. "If you claim to understand this music so well, then show us. Play. Or admit that your little display is nothing but arrogance." Miss Harris half rose from her chair, panic flickering in her eyes. "Nathaniel, you don't have to." But Nathaniel lifted a hand, steady and calm, silencing her. He stepped forward, set his cane against the piano bench, and ran his fingers lightly over the keys. His hands hovered there, not trembling, not hesitant, but purposeful, as though he had spent a lifetime preparing for this very moment. The room leaned forward collectively, breathless. "Very well," Nathaniel said softly, "but before I play, I want to ask something." He turned his face toward the audience, his sightless eyes seeming to pierce through their silks and diamonds. His voice carried with quiet power, filling every corner of the grand hall. "Has anyone here ever lost everything they loved in a single moment and had to rebuild their soul, note by note?" The question sliced through the room like lightning. No one spoke. A few guests shifted uneasily. Others stared at him, caught off guard by the rawness of his words. Alexander forced a laugh, though it rang hollow. "Dramatic words for a boy who hasn't even touched the keys yet." But the crowd wasn't laughing anymore. Something in Nathaniel's tone had shifted the atmosphere entirely. It was no longer about humiliation or inclusion or diversity on display. It was about truth, about pain, about music as something more than performance.
And Alexander, though he didn't admit it, felt the ground beneath him begin to shake. The silence in the hall was thick, almost sacred, as Nathaniel lowered himself onto the piano bench. His fingers floated just above the keys, trembling not with fear, but with anticipation. He drew in a deep breath, steady and deliberate, as though aligning his soul with the instrument in front of him. From the corner of the stage, Alexander Graves stood stiff, arms crossed, his face frozen in a half-smile that now looked more like a grimace. He expected fumbling, a clumsy attempt, something that would confirm to everyone that this was nothing more than a foolish stunt. But when Nathaniel's hands finally descended on the keys, the very first chord made Alexander's throat tighten. The sound was not loud nor rushed, but it was alive. The notes carried a weight that no one in the audience had heard when Alexander played earlier. It was as if the piano itself had been waiting for Nathaniel's touch, responding with warmth and depth to every movement of his fingers. The first movement unfolded, slow and deliberate, each phrase shaped not by the mechanics of practice, but by lived experience. Where Alexander delivered precision, Nathaniel delivered vulnerability. Where Alexander showed control, he offered honesty. Margaret Rothschild, who only minutes before had scoffed at the boy's insolence, felt her breath catch. She clasped the pearls around her neck, not out of vanity, but to steady herself against the sudden wave of emotion pressing against her chest. In the back of the hall, Deborah Carter, Nathaniel's aunt, covered her mouth with trembling hands. She had heard him play countless times in their tiny apartment, but never like this. Never with this force, this audacity, this determination to reveal his heart to strangers who had doubted him. The audience leaned forward unconsciously, their earlier laughter and chatter forgotten. Even the critics, men and women who prided themselves on icy objectivity, found themselves trapped in the current of the music. Dr. Henry Wallace, his brow furrowed deeply, whispered, "My God!" He had heard performances by the greatest pianists of the century, but what was happening now went beyond music. It was a testimony, a confession poured through black and white keys. Alexander shifted uncomfortably, his smug composure crumbling note by note. He recognized the technical perfection, yes, but he also recognized what he himself
lacked. He had spent years mastering fingering, tempo, and phrasing. But what Nathaniel poured into the hall was something impossible to fake. Grief turned into beauty, loss reborn as sound. The boy's blind eyes remained closed, his head tilted slightly upward, as though he were conversing directly with Bach himself. His fingers moved with the precision of someone who had memorized not only the notes, but the spaces between them, the breaths of silence that gave the music its humanity. When he reached the end of the first section, the hall was so quiet that even the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the entranceway could be heard. People didn't clap. They couldn't. They were suspended, waiting, afraid that even a single sound might break the spell. And then Nathaniel leaned into the second movement. It was no longer music. It was raw emotion. Anger, despair, the fury of a boy robbed of his parents, his sight, his childhood. His fingers struck the keys harder now, not with recklessness, but with the precision of someone who understood rage intimately. The piano roared under his hands, filling every inch of the hall with a storm no one could escape. Alexander stepped back unconsciously, as though physically struck by the sound. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the center of attention. He was a shadow, standing in the glow of something greater, something terrifying in its brilliance. And the audience knew. They weren't just watching a performance.
They were witnessing a reckoning. By the time Nathaniel entered the third movement, the atmosphere in the hall had completely shifted. This was no longer an elegant gala where the city's elite sipped champagne and whispered about stock portfolios. It had become a confessional. Every guest seated like a penitent, listening to truths they didn't expect to hear. The music softened now, flowing gently like water smoothing jagged stone. Where the previous movement had raged with fire, this one carried sorrow, wrapped in tenderness. The boy's touch was delicate, yet unyielding, as though each note were a memory too fragile to hold, but too sacred to let go. In the front row, Margaret Rothschild's carefully painted eyes welled with tears. For years she had funded music programs not out of passion, but for prestige, for headlines, for appearances. Yet now she sat powerless, undone by a blind teenager whose name she hadn't even known an hour earlier. She reached for her handkerchief, no longer caring who saw her cry. Across the hall, critics who had spent their careers dissecting performances with surgical precision lowered their pens. No one dared to scribble notes. To analyze would be to desecrate what they were experiencing. And there, near the back, Aunt Deborah sobbed quietly, pressing her hand to her chest. She remembered Nathaniel at 9 years old, stumbling through the darkness of their small apartment, whispering that he would never be normal again. She remembered watching him practice until his fingers bled, refusing to stop until the pain of his loss had a language. Tonight, that language had found its audience. Alexander Graves stood frozen at the side of the stage. His chest rose and fell unevenly, his palms damp with sweat. He had expected this boy to fail, to stumble, to expose himself as an amateur. Instead, every note Nathaniel played was dismantling decades of Alexander's carefully built persona. His flawless reputation had never faced this kind of truth. When Nathaniel reached the saraband, the hall seemed to dissolve into another world. The melody swelled with such vulnerability that guests instinctively placed hands over their hearts. One elderly donor whispered, "It feels like he's playing my life," and received a silent nod from the woman beside him, tears streaking her cheeks. Dr. Henry Wallace, unable to restrain himself, leaned forward, his voice breaking into the silence between phrases. "This boy, he's speaking with the soul of Bach himself." The audience wasn't just moved, they were transformed. They weren't hearing music, they were living it. Each chord became a mirror, reflecting hidden wounds, forgotten grief, and long-buried dreams. Nathaniel's blind eyes remained closed, his face serene, as though channeling something larger than himself. He wasn't merely performing, he was surrendering, offering his very soul as proof that pain could become beauty, that brokenness could birth brilliance. And as the notes reverberated through the gilded hall, one truth became undeniable. This wasn't the humiliation Alexander had planned. It was his undoing.
Kingdom crumble. He tried to hold himself upright, shoulders squared, chin high. But inside, panic roared. Every phrase Nathaniel played was stripping away the layers of authority Alexander had wrapped himself in for decades. Where his own performance had been polished marble, Nathaniel's was living fire. Impossible to ignore, impossible to match. Alexander's ears caught details the audience couldn't articulate. The flawless tempo that flowed without calculation. The phrasing that carried the weight of human grief. The tiny pauses placed exactly where pain lingered in the soul.
These weren't choices Nathaniel had learned from sheet music. They were truths he had earned through suffering. Truths Alexander had never tasted, never could. The applause Alexander had received earlier now seemed hollow, like polite taps compared to the storm gathering for this boy. He glanced toward the front row, Margaret Rothschild, her face streaked with tears, staring at Nathaniel as though witnessing a miracle. Dr. Henry Wallace, leaning forward so far it looked like he might rise from his seat, his expression one of awe. Even Patricia Wells, the Foundation's director, who had allowed Alexander to mock the boy minutes earlier, sat frozen, her lips parted in disbelief. The humiliation was unbearable. Alexander's hands clenched at his sides. He thought of stepping forward, of interrupting, of reclaiming control before it was too late. But he couldn't. To speak now would be to admit defeat, and deep down he already knew. The battle was lost. Nathaniel pressed into the final chords of the movement, his face still serene, his blind eyes lifted slightly as though communing with something beyond the hall. When the last note faded, silence consumed the room. It wasn't hesitation, it was reverence. No one dared to break the spell. Finally, a single clap rang out. Then another and another. Within seconds, the hall erupted into thunderous applause, the kind that shakes walls and rattles chandeliers. People rose to their feet, some sobbing openly, others cheering with abandon. And Alexander? He remained standing in the shadows, his once commanding presence now reduced to nothing. Every eye in the hall was on Nathaniel. Every hand clapping for the boy he had tried to humiliate. The cruel irony cut deeper than any blade. Alexander had invited Nathaniel to play as a joke, a moment of mockery to entertain donors. Instead, he had handed him the stage, the spotlight, and the opportunity to reveal genius. The mask of superiority Alexander had worn for decades was gone, shattered beyond repair. And for the first time in his life, the great Alexander Graves felt small. The ovation thundered through the hall, a tidal wave of sound crashing over Nathaniel as he sat motionless at the piano, his hands resting gently on the keys. He didn't smile, didn't bow, didn't raise his arms in triumph. Instead, he simply inhaled deeply, as though sealing a sacred promise between himself, the music, and the people who had finally heard him. Slowly, he rose from the bench, his fingers brushing the polished wood one last time. The audience remained on their feet, clapping, cheering, some even shouting his name, though most had only just learned it. For the wealthy patrons who had entered expecting entertainment, it was no longer about prestige or performance. It was about revelation. Nathaniel inclined his head slightly toward the sound of the applause, then spoke softly, his words cutting through the noise like a bell. "Music," he said, "isn't about playing notes correctly. It's about playing the tears behind them." The cheering grew louder, many in the hall reduced to tears once more. Even critics who prided themselves on icy detachment had lost their composure, scribbling furious notes that would later become the headlines of the week. And then, as the crowd finally began to quiet, Nathaniel turned, not toward the audience, but toward Alexander Graves. His blind eyes didn't waver. They seemed to see straight through the man standing in the shadows. "Thank you," Nathaniel said evenly, "for giving me the stage." The words, calm and respectful, felt like daggers. Alexander's throat constricted. He wanted to retort, to reclaim some shred of control, but nothing came. His reputation, his superiority, his carefully constructed facade, it was all undone. And by his own arrogance. Dr. Henry Wallace rose from his seat, clapping harder than anyone, then moved forward, his voice rising above the thunder of applause. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, "what you have just witnessed is not the performance of a student or a charity case, but the birth of a true master." The audience erupted again, some stomping their feet against the marble, their admiration unrestrained. Margaret Rothschild, tears streaming freely now, took out her phone, whispering, "This boy must be heard everywhere. The world needs him."
Greatness. Now it would forever be tied to the night he tried to humiliate a blind boy and failed spectacularly. The applause went on, an ovation so long it felt historic. And through it all, Nathaniel remained humble, bowing once, then stepping back with quiet dignity. He hadn't come to destroy anyone, he had simply come to play. But in doing so, he had toppled a giant. 6 months later, the name Nathaniel Carter was no longer whispered in awe among a few astonished patrons of the Grand Metropolitan Hall. It was emblazoned across newspapers, music journals, and television segments worldwide. The video of his performance had gone viral, shared millions of times, with captions like "Blind Boy Humiliates World-Famous Pianist" and "The Prodigy Who Played the Tears of Bach." At 17, Nathaniel walked through the marble halls of the Juilliard School of Music as its youngest full-scholarship student in history. He carried no cane here, only the quiet confidence of someone who had found his place. Professors didn't treat him as a token of diversity, but as a peer, an artist destined to redefine their world. His mornings were spent in practice rooms overlooking Central Park, a stark contrast to the damp church basement where his journey began. Margaret Rothschild, once skeptical, now personally funded his program of study. She established a foundation in his name, dedicated to finding overlooked talent in underserved communities. In interviews, she confessed, "That boy taught me that privilege without purpose is meaningless." And Alexander Graves? His empire of arrogance crumbled overnight. Contracts with orchestras were canceled one by one. Invitations to festivals vanished. Even his European tour collapsed under the weight of ridicule. Reviews once glowing now sneered. Technically precise, but soulless. A pianist exposed by a blind teenager who gave music back its humanity. He retreated to a modest apartment in Queens, far from the penthouse he once flaunted. Occasionally, he taught lessons at a community center, his students unaware or uninterested that he had once been a global star. Every time he sat at a piano, he heard not his own music, but the echo of that night, the sound of a boy playing truth into existence. Meanwhile, Nathaniel's career soared. His first concert at Carnegie Hall sold out within hours. When he stepped onto the stage, the ovation began before he even touched the keys. Aunt Deborah sat in the front row, tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched the boy she had raised alone stand where legends stood. After the final note, Nathaniel approached the microphone. His voice, calm and steady, carried across the hall. Music doesn't belong to the privileged. It doesn't belong to the critics. It belongs to the human heart. And the heart knows no color, no wealth, no boundaries. The audience erupted, their applause lasting 15 full minutes. People weren't just clapping for his music, they were clapping for the truth he embodied. Nathaniel Carter had become more than a prodigy. He was a reminder that genius can rise from ashes, that pain can be turned into beauty, and that arrogance always collapses under the weight of authenticity. Alexander had tried to crush him with mockery. Instead, he had given him an audience. And in that ironic twist, music itself had delivered justice.